Hi everyone, I'm Stephen Downes and we're back again with another video from the course Ethics, Analytics, and the Duty of Care. We're in Module 5, which focuses on approaches to ethics, and as you can see from the title, this is the video on consequentialism. I'm Stephen Downes. I'm offering this course. I'll touch my nose and adjust my glasses and get ready for the glare of video, and trying to make this as interesting as possible. Although I admit, if you're not inherently interested in it, it can be pretty dull stuff. I personally think this is all fascinating stuff, and so that's why I go on about it for a while. And it's because I think it's fascinating stuff that I want to go on about it a while. Normally in a traditional connectivist course, I'd go out, I'd find some resources for you and throw them into the MOOC and create newsletters out of them and invite people to discuss those resources, and that would be that. And that's a perfectly legitimate way of doing it. And you know, if you look at the slides, I have been doing that. There are resources on every single one of these slides, or pretty much every single one of these slides, all of which could be recommended. And eventually they'll all be incorporated into the MOOC website. But I also want to add to those resources, and it's because I want to do something over and above simply pulling these things together. I think that we're working on something that's a bit new here, in the sense that we're bringing together these three distinct topics: ethics, analytics, and the duty of care. And so when we visit some old subjects like ethics and consequentialism, I think we're going to have some new things to say, or at least a new perspective to offer. And so that's why I want to do these videos. So it does change, how I go about doing these MOOCs. Maybe in a second round of this MOOC, and I'm thinking there will be one, we'll go back to the original way of doing it, and the videos will be available as a resource. We'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll never do this again. Who knows? But I want to get these thoughts on the record for now. So with that as a preliminary, today we're looking at consequentialism. Consequentialism is a catch-all phrase for a host of ethical theories, including some of the most widespread and well-regarded ethical theories today. And as you might expect, not surprisingly, they all stem from the concept of consequence. And consequence, as you can see from this definition, which I got from Google, which got its definitions from Oxford Languages, consequence is the result or effect of an action or condition, or alternatively, relative or importance. For example, the saying here, the past is of no consequence, or another example, he wanted to live a life of consequence. Consequentialism is what we might call a kind of teleological ethics. Anything that's teleological is something that has to do with the essential end or the essential outcome in mind. Teleological means goal-directed. There's the whole study of teleology, which is the goal or the meaning or the purpose of life, the universe, and everything. Indeed, one of the big differences that I draw between a network and a system is that a system is teleological. It's a whole bunch of interacting parts moving with a goal-directed or a goal or direction in mind, whereas a network is just a bunch of interconnected parts, but there's no inherent goal, there's no inherent purpose to it. That makes it kind of hard to have an ethics, And so to me, it's not surprising that people both want their networks to be teleological, to be systems, in other words. They want society to be teleological. We unite around a flag and a way of life. And they want their ethics to be teleological. And I get that. So the concept of consequentialist ethics has its origin, at least in Western philosophy, with people like Epicurus, who articulated what might be called the pleasure principle. And here I'm quoting from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy: a view of the goal of human life, happiness, resulting from absence of physical pain and mental disturbance, combined with an empiricist theory of knowledge, sensations, together with the perception of pleasure and pain as infallible criteria. And you kind of need both parts, right? You kind of need to have the sensation itself, otherwise you have nothing to build it on. And then you need to say that some of these sensations are good and others of them are bad. And the most obvious candidates here are pleasure and pain. So you say pleasure is good and pain is bad. Or you could say pain is bad and the absence of pain is good. Or maybe pleasure is good and the absence of pleasure is bad. It's not altogether clear, even on first blush, how to articulate this. So Epicurus was what they call a hedonist, which means that he taught what is pleasurable is morally good and what is painful is morally evil. But, as Wikipedia points out, he idiosyncratically defined pleasure as the absence of suffering, and taught that all humans should seek to attain the state of ataraxia, meaning untroubledness, a state in which a person is completely free from all pain or suffering. And that's not the same as hedonism as we understand it today, right? Hedonism as we understand it today, now I was going to put a sexy picture on the slide here, and I decided to go with sexy Greek men, is a philosophy that much more reflects our idea of pleasure, the pleasures of the senses, the physical pleasures, for example. And yeah, it includes the absence of pain, unless pain is your pleasure, in which case it includes pain. But it sees pleasure as something more of a positive to be gained. There's a lot of discussion by Epicurus and others around that concept, around the original hedonism formed by Aristippus of Cyrene. They were called the Cyrenaics, and they went for this idea of pleasure as, the physical pleasures. And you can see that, who doesn't like, a nice cold beer and a ball game and maybe some popcorn or peanuts or, a nice warm sunny day. How can that be anything other than good? And something that produces that result certainly could be seen as something that's good. But there's this sense in which pursuing that for its own sake isn't really what hedonism is all about, but rather preventing, the pain and the anguish that comes with just being a human is more ethically good. And I don't think we ever get past this one particular distinction right here, but we'll keep plugging away nonetheless. This idea of absence of pain also reminds me of the Buddhist concept of dukkha. And that's a Pali word most commonly translated into English as suffering, or something like suffering. And it's the basis of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, including the existence of suffering, the nature of suffering, and how to end suffering. And according to this philosophy, we are living beings trapped in a cycle of existence known as samsara. And in samsara, we experience unbearable suffering because of the tight grip of our grasping at self. It is in wanting permanence in a world that is forever changing that results in suffering. It is wanting to be an unchanging, eternal being that makes us afraid and suffer at the thought of death. And the secret to escaping suffering is to cease this endless clinging. And that's not an uncommon sort of approach in philosophy and indeed in many religions either. This idea that happiness is attained through mechanisms other than the pure physical pleasures, and in fact, abstinence from the pure physical pleasures and abstinence from clinging to these physical pleasures is what actually produces pleasure, or at least reduces pain. So I think there's a point to it, and I think that that strand of reasoning, as well as the hedonist strand, is with us today. And we'll come back and we'll talk about that more later on. And, you know, we want to talk as well. And I thought about putting, a slide in here with all the varieties of pleasure, but I thought, no, it's actually a bit more accurate in this context to think about the range and varieties of suffering, because there are different kinds of suffering, different degrees of suffering, and they impact people in different ways. I forgot to turn on my recorder. No, I didn't. Oh, good. And it's interesting. I know some people, if they're slightly hurt, their suffering is extreme. And on the other hand, I know people, you could cut off their foot and they'd sort of go, it's an inconvenience to be sure, but I can't say I'm suffering. And everything in between, right? And it's interesting the way we approach suffering, the way we allow it to impact us also has this ethical domain, or ethical dimension, I should say. I talked earlier about Doug Gilmore playing while hurt, and clearly he's suffering, but his ability to work toward a higher goal despite the suffering gives him ethical value, at least in some eyes, and I may as well say my own as well. So we have these ranges, everything from impatience to annoyance to desperation to misery to agony, and we look at this list and you sort of want to ask, where do we draw the ethics line? If we were going to draw a line, right? I mean, is it unethical just to irritate someone? If I do this, is that unethical, or is it just annoying? But if you cause sadness, how about that? What if you offend someone, but it wasn't something that would offend you? Is that unethical? I could say things right now. I won't, but I could say things right now that would offend precisely half my audience and not the other half. And it's not clear to me that we can make a determination one way or another whether one of these is ethical or unethical. But, okay, but there's an intuitive idea here, right, that is worth pursuing, that the prevention of suffering and the promotion of pleasure, that does seem to be an overall good thing, right? That's why we have doctors. And if it wasn't a good thing, we wouldn't really think there was any purpose to having doctors. So that does seem to matter. The other aspect, or another aspect of this entire discussion, can be couched in terms of moderation. Now here I cite Abu Bakr al-Razi, who's recognized in various sources as having a theory of pleasure. Now the interpretations vary, and there's two interpretations that I present here. And for our purposes, it doesn't matter which one is the correct interpretation of al-Razi, but rather the fact that these positions exist. And one is the idea that moderation, it becomes a value is because the way to have the most pleasure is through moderation. Going too far with a pleasure is more painful in the long run. And certainly there's no shortage of people who follow that philosophy, except, say, for Robert Heinlein, who says moderation is for monks, live to excess. On the other hand, al-Razi can be interpreted as saying pleasure is not the good to be sought in himself or in itself. Pleasure can be had only as a result of a process of removing a harmful state. And that seems to be more likely to be the correct interpretation of him, given his stance on spirituality, and also given that his training and influence is as a physician, a doctor, influenced by people like Galen, whose life work is to remove a harmful state. So it's a positive act. It produces something that we might call pleasure, but it's the pleasure of living without pain. And there's an observation here I think is relevant, and that is that in certain respects, it's actually impossible to conceive of pleasure without corresponding pain. And indeed, we could argue that a person would not know what pleasure is without having experienced some sort of corresponding pain. And this is the sort of thing that we see in society. It's like the rich kid who's never known lack of anything in his or her life, right? And they don't recognize what it is like for somebody to have to go without a meal or not be able to fly to Paris in the spring. They just don't have a conception of that. Or even supporters of sports teams that have been very successful don't know what it's like to have an unsuccessful season. But on the other hand, one of the appeals of sports to me is the reality that your team's not always going to win, especially this year, and the idea that this makes it much more satisfying, much sweeter when you actually do win. And winning is more than just the absence of losing. And winning is something that's positive in its own right. So and that's the other side, and the problem with this idea of pleasure as only the removal of pain. If there is no pleasure, how can you know when the pain has ended? And I don't think it's clear that you can. So you're going to have this balance either way. And so you're going to be making this calculation either way. So in the end, it doesn't matter which of these you opt. to support, you're still kind of doing the same kind of thing. And that's why we lump them together under the heading of consequentialist theory. So, what might be thought of as the next major move in consequentialist ethics is the representation of the objective or the value not as pleasure specifically, but rather of happiness. And that's attributed to the Irish philosopher Francis Hutcheson, who says that action is best which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. And that's probably the first original expression of a philosophy that has come to be called utilitarianism. And the term is attributed to David Hume, who uses it to describe the pleasing consequences of actions as they impact people. So now we have two concepts now that we're working with. On the one hand, pleasure, which is directly tied to the sensations. And then we have something else, happiness, which is also tied to the sensations, but not quite in the same way, but not quite the same connotation as pleasure. Again, though, we're looking at the outcome of an act, that is specifically that it produces happiness, as conferring ethical value to that act. Okay, no problem. So that gives us utilitarianism. And so there are two basic principles, and they'll feel both right. The rightness or the wrongness of an act is determined by the goodness or the badness of the results. That's sometimes thought of as the consequentialist principle. And then the utility principle, the only thing that is good in itself is the specific state of pleasure, happiness, or welfare. And I'll just let that tail off there, right? I got this little pigeon graphic from Google. I guess it's created by some thesis bot or something. What are other words for utilitarianism? And the other pigeon replies, pragmatism, advisability, benefit, convenience, effectiveness, fitness, helpfulness, opportunism. Now, none of those are synonyms of utilitarianism or even of utility. So that bot isn't exactly very smart. But they all do express one or another aspects of this concept. And this list is particularly useful because in the modern context, we see these things all the time. I don't talk about American pragmatism in this presentation specifically, but American pragmatism, that is to say, the philosophy of Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey, form the basis for a whole line of thinking about the pragmatic way of knowing, what is true is whatever works, right? And so again, it's the outcome of the act, in this case, whether it's possible, feasible, practical, etc. In business writing, we see words like benefit and fitness used a lot. Sometimes they also use efficacy, effectiveness, efficiency. These are all consequentialist principles being applied in certain circumstances. And if they are applied in a normative sense, that is to say, if they are applied in a sense where you can infer the rightness or a wrongness of an action based on them, then they are expressing a kind of utilitarianism, right? So if you say that supporting an action is good because it produces a benefit, either to oneself or the corporation or whatever, that's consequentialism. That's utilitarianism. We also see it discussed in terms of convenience. That often comes up in market studies. People will pick the convenient option, or offering a product that provides greater convenience is a good thing. We see that presented a lot, as a justification for the presentation of a lot of products and services. And indeed, we come back to artificial intelligence and analytics. Benefit, helpfulness, convenience, fitness, all of these words come up over and over again. There's a very wide swath of utilitarian justifications and arguments in favor of AI and analytics. And indeed, we go back to the beginning of this course, and it was my purpose in the module on applications of AI and analytics to show the benefit that people believe that they realize from this technology. It wouldn't be an ethical issue at all, I argued, and I still argue, if there were not beneficial consequences. If these technologies did not produce, in one way or another, pleasure, happiness, goodness of some sort. So, yeah, utilitarianism is a widely held theory today. But, how do we calculate this? Because this is the thing. Go back to the definition. The rightness or wrongness of an act is determined by the goodness or badness of the results. Well, we need to be able to determine the goodness or the badness of the results. And how do we do that? I threw up a couple of diagrams here. One of them is from a paper that suggests that utilitarianism would argue that a Machiavellian would approve of uploading brains to computers. I honestly don't know what they thought they were proving with this, but that's what the paper said. The other paper here, this is on relationships and environmental ethics in higher education, just shows the dense causal web of actions and interactions in a fairly narrow space. Now, we've got cost, benefit, and accounting and all of that, but we've also got things like gratitude, social relationships, emotional safety, and all of that in a context of complexity, uncertainty, and challenge. How do we calculate all of that? It's a mess. And one of the major arguments against utilitarianism is that no person, or indeed no society, is capable of making such calculations. But let's take it as a hypothesis, just as a hypothesis, for the sake of moving forward, that in the world of artificial intelligence, a computer could do it. Because the volume and the complexity of the calculations doesn't matter to a computer, especially one equipped with AI, right? So hypothetically, we could put the question to a computer and give the computer all the data it needs, and it would come out with the result, X amount of happiness will be produced. And then that, in theory, should tell us the rightness or the wrongness of the action. So, if we accept that as a hypothesis, we can dismiss the complexity argument as an objection to utilitarianism. And to be frank, I don't think anybody seriously advances the complexity argument as an argument against utilitarianism. It's one of these things, they've got their other reasons, and then they'll pull out this reason too, just to add to the pile of reasons. But I don't think It's an actual objection. Because I think off the cuff people know whether their actions are producing happiness or not. And I don't think we need the calculation down to the last dime of happiness to know whether or not we're doing it. So I'm not so concerned about the calculating utility argument. And in any case, we have all the parameters. Jeremy Bentham, who you see preserved in his dead state, came up with something called the philosophic calculus. You can see the play on words with scientific, philosophic, right? Or the hedonic calculus. And it's often commented that in utilitarian circles, the unit of happiness is known as the hedon. So one hedon is one unit of happiness. And we'll come back to that in a bit. So there are 7 principles that he brings forward. How strong is the pleasure or the happiness? How long will it last? How certainly is it likely to happen, or is it really a long shot? How close is it? Are we going to get immediate gratification, or is this a case of deferred gratification? What is the fecundity, the probability that the action will be followed by sensations of the same kind? And if you wonder about that, think about taking drugs, right? You take drugs, they give you this high, it's pleasurable, but then you go into withdrawal, which is miserable, right? So that's not a good thing. So the question is, if you take drugs, what's the probability that you'll keep on feeling happy after? That the effects will be long-lasting, and you won't be thrown into the pits of depression. And that's similar to the idea of purity, right? The probability that it will not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind. Regret, remorse. And then the extent. How many people will be affected? Now, with 7 variables, and here is the calculation problem, right? We can come up with all kinds of different ways of writing the calculus. And it's almost certain, it is certain, that not one of them will be the calculus. There is no E equals mc squared of happiness. And I think back in Bentham's time, they really did think that there would be maybe not an E equals mc squared, but certainly Newton's principles of happiness, because they're looking at this method being applied in other areas, and it's working so well. And why wouldn't a similar sort of scientific approach to the calculation of ethics, why wouldn't it be the same? And now we would probably say something very different. We'd have very different intuitions. But back then, coming up with scientific formula was new for everything. So there wasn't any reason to suppose that we couldn't come up with one and couldn't run these calculations in some way to determine the ethical value of an act. Well, if we get these calculations not right, though, we produce some results that maybe are counterintuitive. And one example is machiavellianism. Now, Machiavelli long predates Jeremy Bentham, so you should have thought about this. But basically, Machiavellians are characterized by the manipulation and exploitation of others with a mocking disregard for morality and a focus on self-interest and deception. A recent American president could be characterized as Machiavellian had he been more effective at it. Um, but it's still the same idea here, right? A Machiavellian will say, basically, the end justifies the means. And that's the reality of political life. And you certainly do hear that a lot, even among people that might be regarded otherwise as ethical and upright people, right? They're great people, but they go into this political situation and the end justifies the means. They're going to do what they need to do because that's politics. And there are other people who just see all of their engagements in life this way. I put up a little thing here, the signs of gaslighting. And I could have picked any number of different examples. I picked gaslighting because it was handy. And you think of all the things that somebody who gaslights somebody does. Their actions contradict their words, they break promises, they erode your self-esteem, they try to make you believe that something is the case even when your senses say that it's not the case. They manipulate you, they deny that conversations or events ever happened even though you know they did. Well, that's the ends justifying the means, right? That's consequentialism. And somebody who gaslights is trying to pursue something that they perceive as a good, namely their own happiness. And, the ethics of it is, the ethics is whatever works. It's pragmatism. It's, all's fair in love and war. And that's an outcome that I think no small number of people would find not ethically strong, to say it mildly. There are different kinds of pleasures. And John Stuart Mill, following up on Jeremy Bentham's work, wrote famously, "It is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." And I think this is interesting because now we're going beyond, I think, a fairly sensory or sensation-based concept of pleasure or happiness and making it a broader concept. And on the one hand, it's a concept that sometimes feels more intuitively appealing, right? You look at somebody who really is what we think of as a hedonist today. All they do is they live for pleasure, that's it. And we think, yeah, they're happy, but it just doesn't seem very meaningful. And we look at somebody who, even though they struggle, they seem to be pursuing a higher good through writing, literature, or art. We have this concept of suffering for your art. You're working for a higher outcome. Even the Doug Gilmore example could sort of play out here. And I think a lot of people believe that. John Stuart Mill certainly did. But now it creates, at the same time, more of a measurement problem. Because, we can directly determine whether or not we have sensations of pain or pleasure. But our sensations of whether we're happy from the higher pleasures are a bit less reliable, shall we say. If we're challenged by a difficult work of philosophy, are we really enjoying it? Or do we just think we're enjoying it because we know we should be enjoying it, even though all we're feeling is pain? I think that's a good question. So, and that's what the Machiavelli example brings up is, a Machiavellian or a gaslighter has some kind of higher pleasure in mind, and it overrides the pig-like sensations of pleasure and pain enjoyed by their victims or subjects. It doesn't matter if people are in pain because of starvation. We're working toward a higher value of a good society, or however they justify it in their heads. And on the one hand, we can just chalk this up to a calculation failure on their part, but on the other hand, it's really hard to come up with, within the context of utilitarianism, an argument against them. And the next case will show even more clearly why. John Stewart in On Liberty said, "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain our own." And this is something, well, on the one hand, this is something I embrace because I think that it is a matter of empirical observation that different people define the good in different ways. What is good for one person is not good for another person. For example, I enjoy cycling, but not everybody enjoys cycling. I know some people who do not enjoy cycling and indeed even wonder why I would enjoy it. Other people enjoy cooking. For me, cooking is something I do in order to get food, and I do the minimum of that to get my food. But it's not something I enjoy for its own sake. Here we have in the image a man preferring the pleasure to his own lawn. It's more fun to mow with with Rio. It's from an old advertisement. Despite, the women in the fancy car, no, that's not for me. I just prefer my lawnmower. The other side of that, though, I've put a little image of Fleetwood Mac's Rumours album here because there's a song on it, Go Your Own Way. And it's a song about separation. And, when each person defines their own good in their own way, there isn't this coming together toward a common good anymore. Each person has gone off their own way, pursuing their own good. So, although it's true we all have our own good, maybe it's not good that we all have our own good. Because here's the result, or at least one result: egoism and dude bro on the right here. There are two kinds of egoism that we can draw out. Psychological egoism, which is the idea that the motive for all of our actions is self-interest. Period, end of story. That just is the fact, according to psychological egoism. As compared to ethical egoism, where the argument is that the motivation for all our action should be self-interest. And you see the distinction between them, right? I think that psychological empiricism is probably demonstrably empirically false. I do think that, as a point of fact, some people perform actions which are contrary to their self-interest, or at least indifferent to their self-interest. A mother caring for her child, for example, isn't doing this just out of self-interest. Although, you can rationalize anything anyways, and there's no shortage of people out there who would argue, well, yeah, but she feels good and she's satisfying herself when she takes care of her child, and that really is why she does it. Or, it's the innate instinct to care for a child, and by caring for the child, she satisfies that innate instinct, and that is serving her self-interest. So you can twist and bend the argument around. But I think, in point of fact, not everything everyone does is for their own self-interest. I have a thesis that I've talked about on various occasions in the past. It's called the butterfly thesis. It's not that butterfly thesis, it's a different one. You drive around or cycle around places here in Canada, and no small number of people have wooden butterflies attached to the front of their home. Just a decoration. They actually spend money because they're hard to make, so usually people go out and they buy them from a craft show or whatever. They're not getting anything out of doing that. Nobody's paying them. Nothing like that. They spend most of their time inside their house, so it's not like they're looking and seeing these beautiful butterfly. They're doing it because it makes the neighborhood nicer. And to me, that's a good example of an unrewarded action that people do anyways. The other side of this is ethical egoism, the idea that all of our actions should be based on self-interest. And, that's become a much more common argument in recent days and deserves some discussion on its own. When I was young, someone called Ayn Rand was becoming popular, not so much in philosophical circles, because philosophically she's, not believable, but in political circles and other discussion circles. And the argument was that basically promoting your own self-interest is good. Or, in the words of the movie Wall Street, greed is good. Now, you've certainly heard that. Now, in the movies, of course, the greedy person gets their comeuppance and spends time in jail and never really enjoys the fruits of their greediness. But you and I know that the real world is not like the movies, in that selfishness and greed is often richly rewarded. And again, I can think of a recent president. And it's hard to argue strictly on utilitarian grounds against egoism, particularly if you allow for a relativism of happiness and value. Why shouldn't you work towards your own self-interest? What actually obligates you to work for the good of someone else? I mean, if I work toward my good and you work towards your good, arguably the maximum good is being served. Certainly there's no easy way to say that it isn't, right? And in fact, if I sacrifice myself for you, there might be, in fact, there will probably be, certainly from my perspective, an overall reduction of happiness in the world. There's no guarantee that what I'm doing is actually leading to your happiness. I mean, I might think I'm supporting your happiness, but probably I'll get it wrong, right? The only person who can really decide what's good for you is you. And we see this argument made with respect to government all the time. That government spending imposes its own value of what is good on a person. And really, what should be done is eliminate all taxation, let each person decide for themselves what to do with the money, because what they decide for themselves is most accurately going to reflect what they believe is good. Government's always going to fall short in this regard, or any charity or any sort of common pool or whatever. It doesn't rule out interacting with other people. Of course you do. But from an ethical perspective, your interactions with them are perfectly ethical if they are motivated by self-interest. That's how the argument goes. It's a very strong argument. And it's an argument that has swayed a lot of people in the present day. Um, I think that in the end it's unsuccessful because I think in the end it's not possible to simply work only in your own self-interest. But how do you couch that in terms of happiness and utility and consequences? It's not clear. And it's certainly not a slam dunk case that you can just go out and say, well, look at what you've produced. Isn't that terrible? Because what's been produced is, to a lot of people, not terrible. This is especially the case if you combine egoism with the concept of what Robert Tivers came up with in 1971 in the idea of reciprocal altruism, which is a type of enlightened self-interest. And the idea of enlightened self-interest is that you understand what deferred gratification means. And you're not always trying to get the advantage in the exact present moment. You can play the long game. And a lot of our characteristic examples of egoists, including the former US president, don't do that. They can't think beyond the next interaction with the next person and how to leverage that into some sort of benefit. But someone who has enlightened self-interest will work with other people, will use things like friendship, go beyond contractual obligation, perform altruistic acts, get the good feelings that come from that, but even more to the point, create this virtuous circle where all of our interactions lift all of us together. Floating, we're a rising tide floats all boats, something like that. Of course, a lowering tide lowers all boats, but that's what happens if you're not enlightened, right? So, again, and this is how the corporate world works, because companies have a fiduciary duty to act in their own self-interest. And how can they justify it? How do they make it work? Well, it's through a process like this of cooperation, forming consortia, forming supply chains, and networks of forming product or domain-based ecosystems, market ecosystems, with the idea that this cooperation, certainly not collaboration, but cooperation, helps them all earn more money in the long run. And again, where on the utilitarian grounds is there an argument against this? It's very difficult to come up with an argument against this. Well, here's how this worked out for me, and your results may vary. In fact, just this morning, in a different context, I posted the following on Mastodon. Mastodon is like Twitter, but without the evil. And I wrote, the funny thing about time is that if you spend it on yourself, it will always feel like a waste of time. And it's only when we are doing things for others that our use of our time seems meaningful. I put here an image from Bob Dylan's album, Slow Train Coming, in particular reference to the song Gotta Serve Somebody. And that's an important principle. And that makes, I think, a difference between the corporate practice, which I think most people would say isn't ethical or unethical, it's just amoral. It has no moral value at all. When all you do is seek to improve your finances There's no ethical value in that. But serving someone, whether it's as an individual or as a corporation, when actually doing things for other, working towards some noble purpose, becoming, as they say, part of something that's bigger than ourselves, that's where this ethical feeling of value comes from. Now, the question here is this a real kind of happiness, or is it just something I made up? And by that, what I mean is, does it correspond to real sensations, or something that I could, at least in principle, measure empirically, or at least recognize empirically? Or is it something that is one of these things I could never know for sure whether or not I was actually having that experience? There's no way to know. No way to falsify, at least personally, a claim that I'm having that experience. And I think that's a good question. For me, personally, it made all the difference. It's the difference between studying just to become smarter and studying so that I can apply the results of that studying to a good cause. Just becoming smarter just seems pointless. Applying it to a good cause is not pointless. And that is consequentialist thinking, but it's not egoist thinking, right? The value of the action, the ethical goodness of the action, the happiness of the action comes not from serving myself, but from serving someone else. Now, is that going to apply to everyone? Probably not. And indeed, that might be the basis for one of the fundamental divisions in our society, that you can't divide the world that you can't achieve unanimity on that question. For some people, serving others creates pleasure. For other people, serving others does not create pleasure. And so you have two competing ethical systems with no real way of deciding between them. Well, to address the problem of measurement, and to address even the problem of, how are we going to calculate happiness? How are we going to distinguish between the value of egoism and whatever? There's a principle we could appeal to called rule utilitarianism. And this again goes back to Mill. The idea here is that instead of evaluating the goodness or badness of actions on an act-by-act basis, which for one thing is difficult to do, and nobody does it, really. And for another, it might lead us to some unintuitive results. Instead of doing that, you come up with rules where if you follow the rule, that will result in more happiness overall than if you don't follow the rule. So that relieves us of the pressure of doing all these calculations. All we need to do is get the rule right. And then, just as in the case of duties, we can have strong rules and weak rules. So a weak rule is kind of equivalent to a prima facie duty. It's a rule, but it's kind of a recommendation and might be overruled by other things, as compared to a strong rule for which there are no exceptions, period, end of story. And clearly you can see, anytime you get into a rule-based system, you're probably going to want a little bit of fudge factor around the edges of a rule, because language really is a blunt instrument here. Well, there is the danger that a retreat, we'll call it that, into rule utilitarianism leads us almost inevitably to moral conservatism. This is an argument that Kai Nielsen advanced. And it's the idea that there are some rules that it would always be wrong to break, no matter what the particular consequences. And I've got the image of protesters in Texas because the recent anti-abortion law in Texas is an example of this, where they just say abortion is wrong, period, end of story. It doesn't matter if you were raped, doesn't matter if the child would not be viable, doesn't matter if your own life is in danger, the rule is the rule. And the thing with this sort of approach is that there's always a higher good that can be appealed to. Again, it's a consequentialist position, and it's this ultimate long-term bad consequences that argue for the inflexibility of the rule. Now, in the case of abortion, the principle here is life, right? That's why they call them pro-life people, right? And preserving the sanctity of life. And the argument is that if you allow things that end life, you are eroding the sanctity of life. And that's a core principle of especially the Catholic Church. Life is sacred. And the Catholic Church has had over the years prohibitions against, for example, suicide. And of course, a long-standing prohibition against murder, which dates back to even before Catholicism. So there is a higher good here. It's a higher kind of consequentialist good. And the good in this case is being used to justify the idea that this rule should never be broken. Well, unfortunately, it's not obvious that results in a position that is ethically defensible. Because you need agreement on this higher good. And even if you agree that life is sacred, even the people who support abortion can find exceptions to that. Many of them will support the death penalty. Many of them will support the use of force by police. Many of them will support the use of military in international conflicts, just to name a few examples. So it's not the case that there is this unanimity about this higher good. And it just becomes something that's very convenient and less about the consequences and more about the conservatism. Another aspect that gets raised often in this context, and often from the perspective of moral conservatism, is the idea of responsibility. And we could do an entire course on the subject of responsibility, but essentially it amounts to the idea that individuals and maybe corporations and maybe governments and maybe whatever are ethically accountable for the consequences of their actions. And the responsibility goes hand in hand with the consequentialist theory of ethics, right? Because if you're not worried about the consequences, then you're not so worried about responsibility for the consequences. Everything depends on the intention of the act and not the result. That's what leads to unintuitive ethical consequences in other fields, right? Talking about virtue ethics or duty, which can result, somebody sticks to a particular duty or promotes a certain aspect of character and is completely ethical but ends up killing somebody. Bad consequence. And that's unintuitive. But that doesn't matter in those principles of ethics. But in utilitarianism and other consequentialist theories, it would matter. It does matter. And so people have to own up and take responsibility for their actions which means dealing with the consequences, whatever that means. Sometimes it means accepting the punishment because you can't fix the consequences. Other times it means paying reparations. Sometimes it just means saying you're sorry, or accepting that, yeah, I did this and it was wrong and I promise not to do it again. It varies. What we mean by taking responsibility varies a lot. But when we're talking about responsibility, it's relevant whether or not the consequences were predictable, whether or not the person intended the outcome, or conversely, whether or not the person displayed indifference to a bad outcome. So there's consequences and there's consequences. I've mentioned this before. If I step on a butterfly and cause it to rain in China and then flood, I am not personally responsible for the costs of the flooding in China. And nobody would expect that I am. Even if it was a direct consequence, and even if we could trace the causal path from that butterfly to the flood in China, nonetheless, nobody's going to ask me to pay for it. Because it wasn't something that I ever thought or ever intended to happen. And because intent matters a lot, even in a consequentialist theory, you can assign responsibility to someone even if the consequence never happened. Because the intent does matter. It takes more of a rule-based approach, like pointing a gun at someone and pulling the trigger is an action that should be considered ethically wrong. That's an example of a rule, which is why we can assign a penalty to attempted murder. Even though the consequence did not happen, we have a case here where it could have happened, it's predictable that it would have happened, and it was intended to happen by the person who pulled the trigger. So, responsibility doesn't include accidental consequences and does include intended consequences that did not actually happen. And I think people are generally happy with that concept. There's always going to be someone who argues around the edges, but I don't think for the most part that people feel that they should be responsible for things that happen completely by accident. Well, then what are the problems with utilitarianism? I read Matthias Melcher's post yesterday or the day before, reviewing this and asking, what is it that bothers people about utilitarianism? What is the problem? And at first glance, it seems to make a lot of sense. Even with the problems of machiavellianism or egoism, we can work our way through that, and I think that's how we approach it, mostly, by trying to show that in the long run, Machiavellianism, egoism produce bad results for everybody. They produce more unhappiness than they produce happiness. Whether in the simple sense that, being selfish doesn't make you happy, or in the longer sense, the broader sense that being selfish creates a dog-eat-dog kind of world that isn't really very pleasant to live in and witness, right? So we can address those. But there are some really intractable problems with utilitarianism and consequentialist theories generally. I couch them here in a couple of sweeping generalizations. One of them is the question of the one versus the many. At least that's how I'm characterizing it. I put that in the form of a few questions. Here's one. Is it better to give one person $1 million or to give 1 million people $1? Well, yeah, the answer to that is they're both equal, right? But they're not, obviously. You give a person $1 and their happiness is really marginally improved. Not very much. In fact, they might not even bother to bend over to pick it up. You know. On the other hand, $1 million is life changing and allows that person not to worry about money for the rest of their life and to spend their entire life doing good, however that may be conceived. We see this argument used a lot by people arguing against taxing rich people. Because, according to the argument, we could tax these rich people and collect a certain amount of money from them. But then if we turn around and spread that money around the rest of the population, the amount is so small for each individual person that we're not really doing any good. So there's no point taxing the rich person. We might as well let them keep the money and let them do the good that they're able to do with it. That's an argument, and it's not a bad argument. On the other hand, does that mean that having rich people in society is ethically good? That's something I think a lot of people will find a little less intuitive. But okay, we can maybe work our way around that. But let's try this one. Is it worth the sacrifice of one life in order to save 5? Now this is Philippa Foot's trolley problem, of course. The trolley problem is, if you pull the switch, you're going to kill one person. If you don't pull the switch, the trolley will continue on its path and kill 5. So the stickiness here is you actually have to pull the switch. You've got to kill the person. And if you don't like it put that way, well then, just there's another example I read in the Podgman and Pfizer book. You come into a small town where there's an execution about to take place, and a bunch of people are lined up against the wall, and the firing squad's there, and they're all ready. And the captain comes up to you and says, "Oh, it's a special day that you're here. I'll tell you what, these people here, they're all guilty. But since it's a special occasion, if you shoot one of them, we'll have you shoot one of them, and we'll let the rest go." So do you shoot them? Well, I mean, most of the people up against the wall are going to say you should shoot them. The captain is obviously going to say that you should shoot them. The firing squad even would say that you shoot them, if only so that they don't have to be responsible for shooting people. Is it worth that sacrifice? That's a hard question, because it's hard to actually put a measure of a value of happiness on a human life. And indeed, the question I ask is the hedon a common currency? And if you're wondering, those are 2 silver hedon pennies that came from a place actually called Hedon in the UK. So there is a hedon currency, but there are only 3 coins in existence. Is the hedon a common currency? Can we, for example, trade a life to slightly improve the happiness of everyone else? So we're not saving anybody's lives. We're just making them a bit happier. For example, we could argue that everyone would be happier if I went and I'm trying to think of somebody who everybody hates. I really shouldn't. So let's just pick Charles Manson. Let's suppose I thought, everybody would be happier if Charles Manson doesn't exist anymore. So I'll go shoot him. And let's suppose that the calculation, which is done by our AI happiness calculator, actually works out to, I'd produce a lot of happiness in the world if I did that. Is it then ethically right for me to go shoot Charles Manson? Well, that calculation maybe I could just shoot an innocent person and make everyone happy. Especially an innocent rich person with no will. I'll shoot them and then take their money and give it away to people. Would that, suppose that made people happy? Would that work? Or, by contrast, are there things, like, say, a human life, that we can't express as a value, that we can't trade off in that way? And this is the difficulty of utilitarianism, is that it does invite the possibility of these trade-offs. It's kind of like carbon pricing for the soul. Because we can start trading. Maybe we're going to agree. A life is it's infinite happiness. Okay, well, how about freedom? If I enslave a certain portion of the population, that would certainly make other people happier because they'd be richer because they'd get all this free labor. What if the economics of that work? Is that okay? For a long time, the economics of that did work, and at the time, people thought of it as ethically fine to have slaves. Today, we don't think so, but is that just because the calculation changed? Freedom of speech. Our society would be a lot calmer, a lot more harmonious if we didn't have freedom of speech. That argument could be put forward. Has been put forward in many cases. Freedom from arbitrary search and detention. Or any number of other actions where you could run the numbers and get the calculation to run your way, right? Maybe you don't deny freedom of speech to everybody, you just deny it to a certain subgroup of society. And that could produce the results. If I squelch the freedom of anti-vaxxers to be anti-vax, that increases the happiness in society because it makes it less likely that people will resist being vaccinated, say. Oh, now that argument's sounding a little bit better, isn't it? What if I shot the anti-vaxxers? That would also have the same effect. Maybe that's too strong. See, that's the problem, right? It's hard to think of ethics in those sorts of terms. So it's not the question of the one versus the many, the way I've depicted it. It's calculating this versus that creates the problem. And it seems like ethics shouldn't be that kind of thing. And those were cases where we agree about the calculations. What about cases where we disagree? And there are two types of this. One, where it's an internal disagreement, and two, where it's an external disagreement. The diagram on the right demonstrates an internal disagreement. Same government in both cases. On one hand, the government is saying peace on earth, goodwill toward men. On the other hand, the government is saying war and ammunition for sale, orders filled promptly. So, to that particular government, both of those are ethical values. Both of those produce good and benefit, right? Peace is good for everyone, but so are good sales. So we have this conflict, and it's not clear how to resolve this conflict. Similarly, we can have two distinct people with a conflicting calculation about happiness. And that's the case in the anti-vaxxer case, right? Some people will agree, yes, we should shut the anti-vaxxers up because that'll produce more happiness in society. Other people will say, no, shutting people up in the long run will produce less happiness in society because we, as a democracy, depend on being able to express these minority opinions. How do you do the calculation? Well, that kind of question's coming up all the time. It has to do, anytime people are talking about political correctness or being canceled or burning books, as again, Texas brings us another example. It's a question of balancing these two objectives. On the one hand, the speech or the book or whatever seems to produce a harm, but on the other hand, squelching the speech or burning the book also produces a harm. How do we decide? And underlining this is the question of whether there really is an objective standard of happiness, an objective standard of what counts as good. It really does seem to just depend on your point of view. And that's a problem for anything that expresses itself, presents itself as an empirical approach to addressing the question of morality. Even if we could have our ethical AI system run the numbers, different AIs would produce different results. And that leaves us with a problem. Unless we could somehow, all of us, get together and determine what the actual objective standard for happiness is. Now, in our society, it's money. And I've been presented in my own work with that argument a lot of the time, right? I need to show what the benefit of my work is. And the only way to show what the benefit of my work is to show how much people are willing to pay for it. Now, happily, that hasn't been the prevailing sentiment over the 20 years I've worked for this one organization, but it has come up from time to time, and it's certainly something that I see expressed a lot. But it sets the stage for what I think is the final, ultimate objection to consequentialist-based theories in general and utilitarianism in particular. And that's the question of moral luck. Now, I think of it this way, because I see this happen a lot. A person goes out, gets drunk to the gills, gets in their car, drives down the highway and kills someone. They spend several years in jail. On the other hand, on the very same day, on this very same road, from the very same bar, another person gets drunk to the gills, gets behind the wheel, drives down the highway, nothing happens. No time in jail. The two acts are identical. The only difference between them is a matter of luck. Why do I say luck? Well, because they're drunk to the gills. They're not capable of hitting or avoiding anyone. I mean, that's why drunk driving is a crime, right? Because you are not, in fact, in possession of the ability to drive. So it is a matter of luck whether you hit someone or didn't hit someone. But we address these consequences differently. And that seems odd. But we address these cases differently because the result was different. And we put one in jail, we don't put the other in jail, unless somehow they're caught on something unrelated. And that seems like luck. And it doesn't seem to me that ethics should depend on luck. I put a diagram here as part of this final slide, how self-made billionaires got their start. Right? So we have Bill Gates. Mom sat on the same board as the CEO of IBM and convinced him to take a risk on her son's new company. Or we have, I'm not sure who that is, who started Amazon, Jeff Bezos. Started Amazon with $300,000 in seed capital from his parents and more money from other rich friends. I think this is Warren Buffett, but I'm not sure. The son of a powerful congressman who owned an investment company. Or Elon Musk, self-made billionaire whose dad happened to own an emerald mine in apartheid South Africa. Now, I raise these examples because people like this, first of all, just in and of themselves, are very often depicted as instantiating ethical goodness. But certainly, they take their money and they do things like start foundations or even pay their taxes with it. And people applaud the ethical virtue of this. But they are in their positions simply because of luck. The fact that one person is super rich and can spend a ton of money addressing disease, and another person is dirt poor and couldn't spend a dime doing that. There's no ethical difference between them. One person was just lucky enough to have all that money to spend, the other person wasn't. And that's generally what characterizes utilitarianism. One way or another, the difference between an ethical action and an unethical action, when it is based or when it is evaluated strictly according to the consequences of that action or even of that type of action, is a matter of luck. No matter what a person's intents were, no matter what a person's means were, it's a question of luck. And I find that coming up with a system of morality that is based on consequences and therefore assigns outwardly extra large ethical value to the extra large actions and contributions of the rich and powerful is very convenient for the rich and powerful. When you only look at the outcome, it allows you to translate being powerful to being good. Because it's a consequentialist theory. Power becomes goodness. And that doesn't seem to me to be an ethical theory. It's a theory. I won't deny that it's a theory. It's a way of calculating how much maybe society finds worth or value in an act or in a person or whatever. But, I don't see it as determining the ethics of an action. Simply to look at where that person just happened to find themselves and what that person just happened to do as a result of that. So, as I say here on the slide, whatever utilitarian is, it's not ethics. So, that's my presentation on consequentialist theories. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was informative, first of all, and filled in some of the background on where this line of thinking comes from. And I hope it also offered some thoughts about where this line of reasoning can go wrong and why. And, if we take this theory now and apply it to artificial intelligence, why it won't work for artificial intelligence, like the other theories. And so I'll leave the discussion there, and I'm sure we'll have more to say on this as time goes on and as we get into the other sections of the course. So thank you for joining me. I'm Stephen Downs, and I'll see you next time.